Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Coming up on the programme today, I'm going to try to wade back into one of the things we discussed with the Mayor of London yesterday, the relationship between drill music and street violence, knife crime in particular. I've never really been a big believer in the notion that video games or films or popular music can destroy civilization as we know it. But just at first glance, I wonder whether this relationship between so-called drill music and gang violence is a little more nuanced than some of the hoarier old chestnuts about Grand Theft Auto being responsible for the collapse of the West. We will also, I think, be returning our attention back to the British High Street. I know it sounds a little bit like Groundhog Day, but after several years of finding this one of the most fascinating subjects for our collective conversation, the Daily Mirror today goes with that classic front page, Ghost Town Britain. If I was incredibly pompous and pretentious at this point, I would say, wither the High Street. Oh, God, I just did. Oh, well, if the cap fits. But we begin, as we so often have during our time together over the years, with the vexed question of Boris Johnson and the curious case of a man who is incapable of telling the truth, somehow retaining popularity in the public eye. I think he could still be Prime Minister. And look, if we live in a world where Donald Trump can become President of America, then do not laugh when I tell you that Boris Johnson could still become Prime Minister. There is one, I bet I can't find it now. I even did some research this morning. I've never done research before in my life. There's one line in Boris Johnson's... I have a flipping left it on the photocopier. I don't believe it. There's one line in Boris Johnson's biography of Winston Churchill. There's one passage in it that sums the man up to a point that is perfect. And the line involves Churchill's decision in the 1930s to oppose Nazism. It's really interesting, this. In fact, it's so interesting, I might send someone upstairs to the photocopier to make sure that I get the words right. If you Google Churchill, Boris Johnson, horse Nazi, you'll find a Financial Times piece. The first paragraph, I'm giving away all my secret. This is how I do it on air. The first paragraph of which contains an analysis of the little bit of the Churchill autobiography that I'm about to share with you from memory. He effectively posits the idea. This is genuinely incredible, I think. If like me, you have a sort of peculiar fascination with demagogues and populists, people who manage to persuade the most vulnerable members of society to make themselves more vulnerable, then this, I think, is absolutely PhD level insight. He looks at the 1930s and looks at Churchill's decision to stand against Nazism early in the 1930s, ahead perhaps of other people realising just how gross Hitler's project would be. Not something, frankly, that would have been easy to avoid if you just picked up Mein Kampf. But there was still, I think, a sense that Hitler, not unlike with Donald Trump, a sense it was too ridiculous ever to come to pass. And this is an astonishing intervention. This is what Boris Johnson thinks of politics in general, right? To some extent, all politicians are gamblers with events. They try to anticipate what will happen to put themselves on the right side of history. Just think about that line for a moment. There is no better distillation of narcissistic self-interest masquerading as political principle than that single line right there, written by our current Foreign Secretary. To some extent, all politicians are gamblers with events. They try to anticipate what will happen to put themselves on the right side of history. That is an admission, unwitting, I imagine, that he doesn't actually have a principled bone in his body. Because he gambles with events. And he's such a narcissist. His self-interest and self-obsession is so acute that he cannot but see the world through the lens of his own pathology. He just presumes that everybody else is like him. A lot of people do. A lot of crazy people do. He presumes that every other politician looks at a set of circumstances and makes a decision about which horse to back based entirely upon what would be best for their personal ambition. Now, regular listeners to this programme will not be surprised to learn that I am not a massive admirer of Margaret Thatcher. But the idea that she took her political decisions based on what she thought would happen and a determination to put herself on the right side of history is about as absurd as it's possible to imagine. This is, if you will, the definition of conviction politics, whether it is a Marxist or a free marketeer, a rabid free marketeer. The idea that they don't have principles is absurd, but it runs through Boris Johnson like Blackpool through a stick of rock. A man who has lied to every employer he has ever had. A man who has demonstrated weapons-grade disloyalty to every leader under whom he has ever served. A man who has lied to both of his wives and all of his mistresses. A man who apparently dreams of leading and could lead, enjoys the support of the grassroots of a Conservative Party that is supposed to care about family values, but somehow continues a ludicrous love affair with a man who has a love child running around West London. That is, if you will, evidence that in his personal life, his political life, and his professional life, he is utterly devoid of anything that remotely resembles morality, principle, or integrity. And still, he continues. Still, he bats away for nobody and nothing but Boris Johnson. This line here, I'm not exaggerating. The more you think about it, the more utterly descriptive it becomes, illustrative it becomes. To some extent, all politicians are gamblers with events. They try to anticipate what will happen, to put themselves on the right side of history. That's quite incredible. And it explains beautifully, for anyone still puzzling over this phenomenon, how he could have written 2 articles on the eve of nailing his colours to the Brexit mast. He wrote 2 articles, one of which explained why he'd elected to support the Remain camp. 2 columns written in their entirety for the Daily Telegraph, and only at the last moment did he decide which way to jump. Only at the last moment did he decide which which gamble he would take, which anticipation of what will happen would put him on the right side of history. And he got it horribly wrong, because he thought Remain would win, but by backing Leave, he would have shored up the support of the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party forever, and he would have been perfectly placed to replace David Cameron if and when he walked. So Johnson gambled with the country, with the stakes entirely his own ambition. He lost, oddly, although they won the referendum, and now he's coming back by throwing collective cabinet responsibility under a bus and demonstrating disloyalty to Theresa May that Michael Howard and David Cameron would have been able to give her a masterclass in. But that's not the worst bit of this Churchill biography. This is actually disgusting, what I'm going to share with you next. This is actually indicative of a man who looks at the greatest Prime Minister this country has ever had and sees a chancer. He sees an opportunist. He sees a self-interested gambler trying to put himself on the right side of history. He doesn't see a man who smelt much earlier than most just how rancid the stench coming from 1930s Germany was. He doesn't see a man who actually put his political future on the line by standing up so robustly and so completely, not only to Nazism, but to attempts in this country to appease Nazism. There we go, we got to 12 minutes after 10 without mentioning the Daily Mail. But that was what Winston Churchill was doing in the 1930s. An awful lot of support for some of Hitler's ideas among the aristocracy, among the vested interests in this country. And Churchill, a scion, of course, of Blenheim Palace and the Duke of Marlborough, Churchill stood up to them, even when it looked as though it could scupper his political career. He moved around a lot, Churchill. It's part of the reason why he wasn't trusted by some members of the establishment. He oscillated from the Liberal Party to the Tory Party. But the idea, and I'm coming to the line now, the idea that Winston Churchill's opposition to Nazism was an opportunistic career move is I mean, it's utterly anathema to all decent, right-thinking people, but it's Boris Johnson's theory, because this is what he wrote in the next line. Churchill put his shirt on a horse called anti-Nazism, and his bet came off in spectacular fashion. So Johnson's narcissism is so complete, so utterly overarching, he cannot even conceive of Winston Churchill's opposition to Hitler being a matter of pure principle. He cannot even imagine that somebody could stand up to something as vile as Nazism without self-interest being the key constituent of that position. Just take a moment to think about that, because it tells you absolutely everything you need to know about this man. Forget the lies about fire engines and fire stations. Forget the lies about ticket offices and staffing levels. Just imagine how completely corrupt you would have to be morally to conclude that Winston Churchill's opposition to the Nazis was a self-serving, opportunistic career move. There is only one way in which you could conclude that. There is only one lens through which you could view the world and arrive at such a vile, vile conclusion. And that is if you are incapable of imagining anyone or anything not acting at all times out of narcissistic self-interest. Boris Johnson is psychologically and intellectually incapable of imagining a political principle in the heart of another human being. And the reason why he is psychologically and politically incapable of imagining that a human being could have a political principle is because he is utterly incapable of having one himself. Every scenario, every situation, every policy, every position, he views solely and exclusively from the position of wondering what's best for Boris Johnson. He put his shirt on a horse called anti-Nazism, and his bet came off in spectacular fashion. And that, I'm afraid, makes sense of everything he's ever said or done or leaked. It's always about him. Which leads me to a question I've asked you before, and it divides the room, I suppose, because despite that utterly incontrovertible description of a man, devoid of principle, devoid of integrity, devoid of any semblance of decency, some people will still be cheering for him. It's not a mystery. Donald Trump got elected in America, a man whose narcissism possibly outstrips even Boris Johnson's. But the question I'd like to ask is how he gets away with it. On a more prosaic level, why doesn't Theresa May just sack him? Because this is about as close to the definition of breaching collective cabinet responsibility that it's possible to get. Speaking to party members, Conservative donors, he completely rubbished his own Prime Minister's current position. That is the definition of disloyalty. In any other circumstance, at any other point in British political history, he would be out on his backside faster than you could say Boris Johnson. But he's still there. And how does he do this? How does he get away with it? Simple. Because every single calculation is about what's best for him. So the question I'd like you to have a crack at answering from whatever angle you want, and I would welcome people who like Boris Johnson onto the programme. He can't argue with anything I've said, unfortunately, because it's on the record. He wrote it down. But you can tell me why it doesn't bother you. You can tell me why you think, yeah, well, maybe Churchill was actually a bit of an opportunist who only stood up to the Nazis because he thought it would smooth his path to 10 Downing Street. It's a pretty gross conclusion to arrive at, but, you know, everybody's welcome on this programme. How does Boris Johnson get away with it? 0345 6060 973. So how does he do it? Lies to his wives, lies to his mistresses, lies to his bosses, his employers, his party leaders, his constituents. He was supposed to be lying down in front of a bulldozer to stop the third runway at Heathrow, but apparently he's going to be away when the vote actually reaches the House of Commons, and a party that is supposed to care about family values is still embarked upon a sort of psychodrama love affair with a man who treats his marriage vows with complete contempt. So why? Why does Boris Johnson get away with it? How does Boris Johnson get away with it? And you can park all of that, his past, his CV, just look at yesterday and today. Utter contempt for the concept of loyalty. How? How is he still in the game? You tell me, because I don't know anymore. 0345 6060 973. Sam's in Liverpool. Sam, what would you like to say?
Well, James, yeah, I think your quote sums him up very well.
It's an astonishing piece of work, that, isn't it? That line from the Churchill. The idea that you could look at Churchill and think, yeah, he's just an opportunist like me.
Yeah. Well, he's just a tactician, and when you hear how he's talked about other figures in the past, and he talked about the EU and how Napoleon and Hitler tried to unite Europe. He just thinks of these great men in history, and that he has to be one of them. And it's entirely his ego. And when you're in a job like politics where you're supposed to work for the people,
so how does he get away with it then?
Well, we've got an incredibly inept prime minister. I think we all can recognise that.
I don't mean that so much as why when it is so obvious. We're back to Emperor's New Clothes territory. Is the buttocks are quivering before us, and some people still think he's wearing robes. How can you just run through that catalogue of calumny and corruption, and conclude that he could be a good prime minister? How does it happen, Sam?
I think it's a really baffling question. I think to a lot of people, his view has changed, actually. I think he's far less popular than he used to be.
Possibly.
It's a baffling question. I think partly, not to bring up, the man in the seat in the White House every time I come on, but it is sort of that creating his own news, so you sort of forget about what he said before. And yeah, it's just this sort of mystifying air he sort of seems to have compared to other people. The fact he's known as Boris. I don't know any other politician who's really referred to by their first name in this country.
Well, Jezza's moving in that direction, I suppose. But
I'm a fan of his, and I'm not a fan of that. But yeah,
sure. So you're as baffled as I am. I mean, I enjoyed talking to you. It'd be a very lonely hour if nobody rang in. But the idea that you could either defend your enthusiasm for him against the backdrop of what I've just listed and described, no opinion there really, all fact, all killer, no filler, or like me, you can just sort of go, well, I mean, look, I can see his quivering buttocks. Why do people still think he's got clothes on?
But it's not just about him exposing himself. I think it's really dangerous. The way that he talks about things. You brought up the fantastic letters that he wrote for both arguments, for both sides in the referendum.
The columns, yeah.
But yet he was fueling that. In 2012, he was talking about how good it would be if Turkey could join the EU.
Yes.
That was one of his main
made a film about it. He has a Turkish grandfather.
One of his main arguments against being in the EU was that Turkey could join. It's really dangerous when people do that and select sides like that, I think.
Indeed, although I don't think that, however long we converse together, I don't think we're going to have any breakthrough moments on what it is that other people see. It's going to be one of those days where I look at the text. You just never know how representative these are. Here's David. Mohammed O'Brien, never mind Boris, you are the one who is bonkers. You and your naive England haters should be rounded up and shot, but that won't happen. Why? Because the lefty politically correct disease has spread through all of British society, says David. Good grief. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. How does it happen? What is it? And I'll take it from people on side who are cheering for him, despite the incontrovertible evidence that he is about as reliable as a Morris Marina. Or I'll take people who, like me, have spent years now wondering when the scales are going to fall from the eyes of the rest of the British public. If you were in London during his mayoralty, you'll know that he told lie after lie after lie after lie, culminating, I guess, in the legacy of him seeking election in Uxbridge by promising to oppose the third runway. I don't think he's said a word on it yet, has he? It's not as if he's keen to obey Theresa May's rules on what he can and can't say, because this speech of him putting the boot into Theresa May has been leaked. John's in Stockport. John, what's going on?
For me, this all starts with the media. The media built up this persona of this bumbling fool of and the fact that I think the last caller said gave him a first name. To me, this is all the media.
It's not even his real name, is it? It's his middle name. He's called Alexander, but that wouldn't. You couldn't be known as Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson.
Right.
You couldn't. That's with a silent P, de Pfeffel, like the ones you do in the bath.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I think it's all the media. They built them up, and accumulating in his London mayoral election based on the fact that
he was good on Have I Got News for You?
He's a bit funny. Even now, in his latest calamitous moments, that poor Iranian woman the poor British woman who's stuck in an Iranian jail, where
Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, yes.
Doubling her jail sentence. It's still, the question was on, I can't remember, BBC, ITV or Sky was, well, isn't this just Boris being Boris? You're like, this is people's lives that are being ruined. And for me, this is all on the media. The media built this personality that the public have just accepted, which, for some unknown reason, the public in this country seem to accept weird
deference. It's the big breakthrough for me of the last 2 years is the forelock tugging and the cap doffing. I had no idea it was still so deep rooted. Jacob Rees-Mogg. I mean, you know, a man on a sort of secondment from the Beano who's treated as a serious political figure now by pretty much every other columnist and commentator in the country. It's absurd. It's insane.
It is absurd.
If he had your accent, he wouldn't be on telly.
No, exactly. That for me is what happened. It started off with that, and now no one know what to do. It's gone on too far. And as for Theresa May, I mean, has any country had someone in power who's not in power? I mean, there must be other examples, but this must be the first in this country.
Possibly Charles II. I don't know. I don't have that period of history.
Maybe get a historian on to try and say, has Britain ever had someone who's not in power? The
country's had enough of experts, John. You should know that by now.
Yeah, we should know that, yeah.
27 after 10. Another voice of bemusement, frankly, at how this can be allowed to continue. Our country could be, and despite the disaster that he's already done more than most to bring about, he's poised now to make things even worse. Just to refer to these things that have been leaked, the two essential platforms of it, well, three really. Theresa May's doing an awful job. You'll notice that he hasn't said anything about how she could have done a better job. The suggestion that Donald Trump could have done a better job tells you absolutely everything you need to know about what he's doing. He's giving and I called them lemmings earlier, which is perhaps a little unfair. He's giving the unicornists, the people who still believe that there's a wonderful plan which just hasn't been discovered yet. There's a wonderful path to success post-Brexit. It's just that no one knows what it is. But they will. It'll be along any minute. He's got to give them something. And what you'll notice if you listen to this programme, on the rare occasions that these people pluck up the courage to ring in instead of sending texts wishing that I get assassinated, on the rare occasions that these people pluck up the courage to ring in, you'll hear them repeat these phrases. You'll hear them say, they make all our laws, or they need us more than we need them, or we can't control our borders. You'll hear them say these phrases, and you'll hear me just ask them very politely, with great love and tenderness, to explain what they mean. And they never can, ever, not once, in all the years we've been doing this. And that's why Boris Johnson does it. So on other phone-in programmes in the coming days, expect people who ring in, convinced that Brexit is still a good idea, expect them to start saying that the Irish border is no big deal. Because he has to give them a slogan. He has to give them a little placard that they can wave to camouflage their own utter ignorance. And that's what he's very good at. It's what Donald Trump is the best at. Build the wall, lock her up. Meaningless, fatuous slogans. But you give them to angry, not very clever people. And remember, half of any population is of below average intelligence. So you give them to very angry, not very clever people, and it prevents them. It means they don't have to think about things. Because the minute you start thinking about the Irish border, Brexit falls apart like a cheap suit. So you've got to give them something that means they don't think about it. What are you going to give them? Well, just tell them that it's no big deal. Yeah, but that's the most absurd misrepresentation. It doesn't matter though, because they're not going to think about it. They're just going to repeat, oh, the Irish border is no big deal. The Irish border is no big deal. The Irish border is no big deal. No real defenders of Boris Johnson. No one actually prepared at the moment to explain why they like him. Lots of abuse of me coming in, but that's not really the same thing, although I appreciate that if you can't work that out for yourself, I'm probably wasting my breath. Here's someone called Graham in Exmouth. I bet your bank balance is so grateful for Brexit, James. Is it fair to point out that that's not how you spell grateful? Probably is, actually. Let's be honest, you would not have had the followers had it not happened, and had you not had the opportunity to divide the country further. Believe me, 17.4 million will not be changing their minds, and should we be betrayed, the rise of a far-right party will come all the sooner. Be careful what you wish for, says Graham the Gammon in Exmouth. Bob's in the city. Bob, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Bob.
My view on Boris is that he's actually playing the role of a caricature that he's invented. All of his friends and family call him Al. Boris is just a caricature.
Yes.
And he has been created by television, by the right-wing media that never said anything against him. And yet he's yet another person that's come out of Have I Got News for You, this lovely, bumbling character that he portrayed on there. He brought the people of London to love him as some sort of clown that became mayor. Still a bumbling fool while he was a mayor.
Utter artifice, isn't it? Utter artifice. He's none of those things.
Exactly. Yeah, he is quite smart. In fact, I have read 2 of his books, and he writes very well. Very well. He's London. I read his history. His
MI6 getting involved. Something gone wrong with the phone line. So it sounds like the security services. Oh no, it might have been the weather.
He's a clever man, but what he portrays is this buffoon that the right-wing media love. That he's hoodwinked a load of people that think he's okay. Oh, you'll be all right. He's just Boris. But he is a very dangerous character because within himself he is quite smart and he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that the Prime Minister that he has is absolutely weak, has no choice but to keep the Brexiteers going. And this is not a normal government. And of course, there is no opposition. Jeremy Corbyn does not oppose anything that is good for the country at the moment. Well, anything that's bad for the country, he doesn't oppose.
But that's not new, though, is it? I mean, well, I suppose Theresa May's position is new, but his utter dissembling isn't new. It's been going on forever, and we're back into that similar territory, actually. Whether you're talking about Brexit or Trump, where you describe reality, which you've just done, but of course, anybody who denies reality can claim that you're condescending to them or sneering. Because you can say, look, here is a completely fraudulent individual who masquerades as a sort of bumbling, likeable buffoon, but actually exists solely to promote his own interests and fulfill his own ambitions. And essentially you end up, whether you intended or not, you end up marvelling at the stupidity of people who can't see it.
Yes, but I think that the people who have been hoodwinked, who go along with this, I think this is where we do have something in common with Trump, in that once you can instill fear in people, once you've instilled fear, then you can instill hate, and then you can make them do what you want them to do. So if you look at Trump's core voters, he complains about the Mexicans, he complains about the Muslims.
London is a war zone. Remember, you can't come here. No-go zones all over the place. Retweet Britain first. Get some fag packet fascist on Fox News to slag off his own country for a 250 quid cheque, and Donald Trump will be beside himself with glee.
Exactly, and then you look at all of the lovely commentators that we've got here, you know. Isabel Oakeshott, your Kate Hopkins, pushing out the same diatribe. And what happens is you get tribal behaviour. So even if they do something abhorrent, the core of their backing stays with them. Whatever they do, they will, and they have, you know, will of the people, all of these...
This is the one thing. I don't come all the way with you on that, because he doesn't do the anti-Muslim bigotry. But partly, I suppose, because in familial terms he'd struggled to. I don't know what his grandfather's religion was, but he was certainly Turkish, wasn't he? And he doesn't do that. I think when you look at that Churchill quote, you can imagine him doing it if he thinks, well, that'll get me over the line into 10 Downing Street. Then, but he doesn't actually do the... I did it a little bit with the Turkish stuff in the referendum, but I don't see him as one of the people who the Daily Mail will ring up for a quote whenever they want a story about how awful Muslims are.
Yeah, I just do agree with you on that one. The other thing that he needs to be careful with Churchill is Churchill was, of course, a great proponent of the EU, and he cherished the fact that that Europe should come together after the war and become a union of trading states. So when people throw out Churchill as look at, you know, Churchill sing UK and as great leader and all that, well, he was a great proponent of the EU. Thatcher was a great proponent of the EU, albeit that she fought tooth and nail for everything that we wanted. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, similarly, he just says all these things, and people think, oh, yeah, great Churchill. But these people wanted a united Europe to prevent war in the future.
And that is what Justin Welby was referring to the other day when he somewhat excitedly described the European Union as the greatest invention of humans since the Roman Empire. And, hey, do you know what you've reminded me of? The World War III line. That was Boris Johnson as well. It was never David Cameron. But people still don't realise this. People still don't realise this. Because, again, what you do, you give these people a placard. They need a placard to wave that prevents them from having to think about things. So when you point out all the stuff that's going wrong, all the stuff that's going to go wrong, and then they turn around and say, oh, yeah, but World War III hasn't happened, has it? So there were lies on both sides, and they're allowed to get away with it by other journalists. But, of course, what that overlooks is the fact that nobody on the Remain side ever mentioned World War III. David Cameron expressed a belief that is shared by almost everybody who is informed on the issue, that the European Union has, as Churchill intended, helped ensure peace in continental Europe on a scale that is unprecedented in epochal terms over the centuries. Peace in Europe since 1945, not complete, because there are problems in Yugoslavia, military juntas in places like Spain and Greece, but essentially speaking, in terms of internecine warfare within Europe, it has been a period of unprecedented peace. David Cameron put forward an opinion shared by Winston Churchill that European Union has had something to do with that. The same day, later that afternoon, his old schoolmate and rival Boris Johnson said that Dave had predicted World War III. And what is the story now that is still being waved by the placards of people who will do anything to avoid having to think about things? Well, we haven't had World War III yet. That was Johnson. It's almost as if every rock you look under, he's wriggling under. There he is. Where are we going next, Pimlico or Geneva? Geneva. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Mark.
My effort at answering... my effort at answering the question of how does he get away with it is this. I think it might be connected to kind of perception of competence.
Yes.
The idea that if you put him up against Jeremy Corbyn and you look at private and public life, like everybody knows, I'm not getting into talking about Jeremy Corbyn, it's just an example, but everybody knows Jeremy Corbyn can grow his vegetables in a row in an allotment, and he has a very quiet life. If memory serves, his divorced wife, had nothing bad to say about him. He's just a workaholic. But the idea that in his public life, he's presented as being shambolic, whereas with someone like Boris Johnson, it's kind of the inverse. It's the opposite. And I think so. The answer I'm trying to give is that if you zoom in on Boris Johnson, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But if you zoom out and you just see that has to be something that's being pushed behind the scenes by kind of, Tory spin doctors, people in the media.
Are you doing the job of? Are you doing the job that you're describing, though? I don't know that there has been a big conspiracy. I'll tell you what happened when he went to Brussels. After he got fired by the Times... God, every rock you look under. After he got fired by the Times for making up quotes from his own godfather, and he got picked up by the Daily Telegraph because somebody would have made a phone call and called in a favour, and he ended up in Brussels, and he has said himself he couldn't believe... The description he employed was, I'd lob these bricks over the wall from Brussels, and I couldn't believe the sound of the greenhouse shattering back in London, and this is where all the bendy banana stuff comes from and all the other myths that have taken root over the last 30 years. And his bosses just liked... I mean, they didn't have clicks and likes in those days, but the equivalent, the noise that it made, the readers that it delighted, the letters that it prompted from the shires and the colonels, I don't think it was deliberate. I don't think there's a puppet master pulling strings that have put Boris Johnson in the Foreign Office. I think it's just been a curious cocktail of epic self-interest and self-promotion and a kind of lazy chuckling on the part of people who should have known better. Oh, good old Boris. And only when it's too late do they realise there's nothing good about him at all.
Yeah, no, I totally take that point. That's true. I didn't mean that there was underground kind of suspicious conversations going on, particularly about Boris Johnson. It's more that wider zooming out view of it's just the fact that at the moment Labour are perceived not to be competent, whether it's because of infighting or because of who's leading their party. And I would support that claim by saying that from an Irish perspective, the fact that the British government, that the DUP are involved.
Propping it up.
For Irish people, that is equally mind-boggling.
Of course it is.
For
Of
British
course it is.
people.
I've been looking at some of the comments made by, what's his name, Sammy someone. Is there a DUP MP?
Yeah, Sammy Wilson.
That's the fella. We need to dig it out, actually. I don't want to misrepresent anybody, but some of the stuff that's been said to me is actually beyond belief. Thank you, Mark in Geneva. Alex in Pimlico will be up next. The time is 10:45. As things stand, I'm going to continue with this conversation for the very simple reason that I've forgotten a lot of the stuff that adds to the perception of Boris Johnson as the single most morally corrupt politician in the history of this country. All right, except Jeremy Thorpe. But I'd forgotten he got fired from the Times for making up quotes from his own godfather. I'd forgotten that he admitted that he was lobbing bricks just to cause trouble back from Brussels, smashing up the greenhouse and enjoying the sound that it made. I'd forgotten about that. Even me, with my levels of obsession, I've forgotten a lot of the awful stuff he's done. I wonder how long it would be. How long would we have to carry on talking about Boris Johnson before we stop stumbling over yet more evidence that he has the moral fortitude of a spangle? How has the mother of all parliaments ended up with a foreign secretary so completely and utterly unfit for purpose? Whether you're it doesn't matter what your politics are, actually. If you're a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, you wouldn't tolerate a foreign secretary slagging off the Prime Minister. And what about all those Brexit loons who say we have to get behind Theresa May, that the only way we're going to make a good fist out of the mess that's coming is by getting behind her? And Boris Johnson makes a speech slagging her off completely, and you're still on his side. I'm going to keep pointing this out because I can hear pennies dropping. And it's not pleasant to realise just how completely bamboozled you've been. I fell for the Boris shtick. I fell for the Boris shtick when Ken seemed to be losing his grip a little. And Johnson, I remember I saw him once in town. He was coming towards me on Charing Cross Road. Hello, comrade, and all this sort of thing. And I was charmed. I was charmed by him. And I'm not suggesting that I have a better tuned scoundrel radar than anybody else does, but I'm pretty cynical, especially about politicians. I can fall for his charm. It's no mystery that lots of other people have. The mystery now is why the scales haven't fallen from everybody else's eyes. I mean, what is it he has to do for the truth to be? He's got people imprisoned by rogue regimes as Foreign Secretary. His job is to get them out. He's made her situation worse. He talks undiluted twaddle about the Irish border, secure in the knowledge that the people he's really addressing will be grateful to him for sparing them the effort of actually thinking about things. He's admitted to utter U-turns on a whole heap of issues, and he thinks that Winston Churchill's opposition to Nazism was a careerist example of opportunism. I guess the answer to my question is probably, if the scales haven't fallen from your eyes now, they never will. But then I keep being encouraged by the sounds of pennies dropping up and down the country. Actually, as far afield as Geneva. Alex is in Pimlico. Alex, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Cards on the table, Brexit here, loving Trump's work, and...
What's your favourite bit?
Well, all of it, but I think what you...
No, your favourite bit. What's the thing he's done that you love the most?
You said you bumped into Boris yourself.
Go on, mate. I just asked you a question. You said cards on the table. You said cards on the table, but you're not letting me look at your cards. That's an odd way of playing.
Because I want to just cut to the chase. Boris...
No, cards on the table. What's the thing Trump's done that you love the most?
Because he is a man of his word.
What's he done that you love the most?
Pardon?
What's he done that you love the most? You said, I'm loving his work. So what's the act of...
Because he's a politician who tends to, unlike here, do what he says.
Yeah, so what's he done? Well, what's the thing he's done? What's the act of work he's done?
Not in tune with the American politics.
Cards on the table, I love his work. Give me one example of the work that you love. Over to you, Alex.
Balls of steel. Okay.
No, but you're going to have to answer it before we carry on, because it's cards on the table, Alex. That's your own words, mate.
Because he's very much like Boris. He's a cad, he's a rogue, he's always...
No, but we know all that. You said you love his work. You said cards on the table, I love his work. So show me one card. They're on the table, Alex.
What I'm trying to say to you is he's a politician, but he's not of the normal politician.
Cards on the table, Alex. Just show me one of those cards that you said in that really, really upbeat way. Cards on the table, James. I love his work. So show me one card. One card.
James.
One card.
Some people voted Brexit, others didn't. And
one card, Alex.
Carry on.
One card.
I'm not with you, James.
One card.
I'm not with you, James. I'm trying just to...
I love his work. Cards on the table. Give me one example of the work that you love.
So much work, because James...
So much work. So much work. It'll be really easy to give me one example.
No. Everybody in London voted for him, remember?
Nobody in London voted for Donald Trump. Give me one example of the work he's done that you love, Alex.
People voted for Boris, remember?
Cards on the table, Alex. Cards on the table, Alex. Show me a card.
I'm just not that in tune with American politics to give you a definite answer, but I'm trying to say to you,
Right,
Boris,
so when you said cards on the
talking about-
table, what you meant was, I don't even know whether I'm playing Snap or poker.
No, I'm trying to say to you, Boris, you have to embrace what he is, and people voted for him, right or wrong. He is a bit of a clown. He's everything you said he is. And I think he orchestrated this leakage. I think a friend of that recorded that. It was all done on purpose and construed to make a lot of media interest and chaos talking about Boris. And remember, when he went on the Marr show talking about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, he inadvertently spilled the beans of his MI6, MI5 briefings straight out to Marr.
No, he didn't know now. So, you see, not only have you made a complete cretin of yourself, you've also just libelled the Foreign Secretary.
Why not? Everyone else does.
No, mate. You see, cards on the table, Alex. You're a clown. No. Tim's in Leatherhead. Tim, what would you like to say?
Well, I was going to say something, but then actually Alex has just taken the biscuit, really.
Go on.
I think the biggest problem is that Boris, as much as we might despise him, is the best that they've got. And that's the sad indictment. The bar...
Of everything.
The bar
No, but he's not... What do you mean by the best that we've got? According to what measure?
Well, generally, the bar is so low for the quality of statesmanship and morals in public life that Boris is actually the best of them.
No, he's not, though. There are plenty of people who... What about someone like Dominic Grieve? But you mean if it has to be someone who is still pretending that Brexit is a good idea, then Boris Johnson is the best that we've got.
OK, you've stumped me there. You're right.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it?
What I was going to say before Alex...
Because otherwise it's Nadine Dorries or Jacob Rees-Mogg. So against that, I mean, in that field, even Boris Johnson looks like a winner.
You know, if it wasn't so serious, it would be funny, wouldn't it?
Cards on the table, Tim. Yes.
I was going to ring you and say something else, actually, and I was going to take issue with your claim that these sound bites are being put in front of people who aren't very intelligent.
Yes, it's a little unfair of me, perhaps. So there are plenty of intelligent people that are falling for it as well.
And that is even more worrying.
Yes, it is.
I was out last week with an accountant and an actuary who both spouted the EU's accounts have never been signed off.
Yeah, I know. Demonstrably untrue.
You point them at the EU website and you see that the 2016 accounts have been signed off.
It's one Google away. But these are people who say things like, cards on the table, they need us more than we need them. And then you say, go on, prove it. And they go, well, I'm not actually that in tune with anything at all. Sorry, I rang in. I just soiled myself live on the radio.
You might as well talk to a brick wall, but the question is, what are we going to do about it?
And the question is, how do you get the brick wall to reply? And the answer is, it's very, very difficult, but they'll probably send an abusive text. Shams is in the city. Shams, what is going on?
Oh, James, all right, can I preface this with the fact that this is historically how I felt about Boris, not how I feel now.
Okay.
Because it couldn't be so diametrically opposed. Opposite. Well, I fell for his charm. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah.
For the cult of personality. He did a lot of good for London in the sense of the...
and he's funny. He makes me laugh. He's funny, you know. It's a good thing.
The Boris bikes, the LGBT community, a lot of the concerts, the concerts, etc. I went to and he made speeches. He was excellent. And also, let's not forget 2012, the Olympics, when the UK was how I want the UK to be. From a
2012 Olympics, mate. That was it. That was the peak, wasn't it? Peak UK.
And now I can understand. I have why the cult of personality for the likes of the Trumps. I was willing at that time to forgive him for a lot, but him playing away from home, all the issues about lying, as the gentleman previously said in his articles, etc. But it soon came home to me when the debacle of the Brexit, when he decided at the last minute that he was going to vote for Brexit, then decided to pull out, and that's when I realised. I can't look at him. I can't look at him the same. If he stood by his principles of being a Brexiter, I would still have a lot more respect than I have for him now. Now I despise him.
Do you? That's strong.
Yeah, I do. I just feel that he's just after, as you've said on many occasions, he's just for himself, for Boris. That's it. No one else. He doesn't care about the country. He doesn't care about anyone else. It's just about him. And this is coming from someone that used to really enjoy seeing him on TV when he got caught on the zip line, rather than that being a political catastrophe for.
But then we're back to the question of. I mean, the last caller obviously is going to be emblematic of the problem that we're describing. He's utterly convinced that someone's brilliant, but can't give you a single reason why. The failure of the scales to fall from the eyes of people like Alex is attributable to what? What does he give them? What is he getting from him?
I'm sorry, but this is going to sound so harsh and horrible, and I'm going to get probably the intelligence, the lack of intelligence. It's just you're willing to bury your head so far in the sand for someone like Trump that it doesn't matter how many times he hits you over the head. It's like having a best friend that will constantly let you down. Your whole life is somebody else's fault, and I'm here to tell you that it's all the fault of Muslims, or it's all the. I get that with Trump, but I don't get that with Boris. Boris, I think even I wouldn't go that far. He doesn't do. Well, he did. I suppose he said the EU. No, you're right. It's not racist, though, to say that the EU is the reason why your life is a bit rubbish. It's a lie, but it's not racist. It's not quite racist in the same way that Trump tries to blame it all on Mexicans and Muslims. Also, for the record, Shams, as Twinkle Troughton has pointed out, the bikes and the Olympic bid were the work of Ken Livingstone, not Boris Johnson. But I guess the fact that he's ended up having bicycles named after him that were the idea and the brainchild of his predecessor kind of... It's peak, well, not peak, but it's very emblematic of Johnson. Right, quick heads up. Should we carry on with this? Because I'm having a grand old time. Cards on the table, I'm loving it. It's, in a way, actually, the stuff that Boris Johnson does, giving people slogans, giving people placards they can wave in order to avoid ever having to think about anything. It's peak Brexit, isn't it? It's they need us more than we need them. We're getting our country back. Ask people what these phrases mean, and they can't tell you. But cards on the table is similar, actually. It insulates you from actually having to explain. Cards on the table, here's what I thought. All right, well, show me the card. I can't. I actually don't know why I think what I think. I've just got a feeling, not a thought. It's crucial. It explains Western politics at the moment, the difference between a feeling and a thought that has been arrived at after contemplation and cogitation. So what do you think about the Irish border? Well, if you've genuinely thought about the Irish border, you can only have concluded that this is the Gordian knot that could banjax the whole of Brexit. It always was. Any attempt to have regulatory alignment, as is required under the Good Friday Agreement, and to have two separate customs unions, as became a requirement when Theresa May very oddly wrote her red lines. Anyone who thinks about the Irish border has to conclude that it's incredibly complicated and incredibly important and quite possibly insoluble. Boris Johnson, of course, is the patron saint of people who hate thinking. So what he does is simply say, it's no big deal. And then you can repeat it. Cards on the table, it's no big deal. The tragedy of journalism in this country at the moment is that nobody, next time they've got him in a studio, will ask him to explain. Nobody will force him to explain. And the other bit of the narrative that's been allowed to go unchallenged is the idea now, all the people that told us everything was going to be brilliant immediately are now saying, well, there may be some short-term problems. Where does short-term come into it? How do the people who said everything was going to be great get to tell us now that things aren't going to be great, but the bad stuff will only be short-term? Well, on what possible platform did they earn our trust? People who told you there'd be 350 million quid a week for the NHS, who are now saying that we're going to be worse off. Why would you trust them when they say it'll be short-term? They told you it was going to be better. You see? This is Johnson in a nutshell. Oh, I don't want to think about it. Give me a slogan that I can just sort of throw at people when they point out reality to me. You lost, get over it. That'll do, won't it? Yeah, what did we lose? You lost the vote. Yeah, but what did we lose? Well, why do people still care about this? Answer, because we're doing unnecessary damage to ourselves. No, we're not. Everything's going to be great. We'll be able to trade with China. Germany currently trades with China by a factor of 5 times more than we do. What is it that Germany can do with China by a factor of 5 times more than we do that we can't do because we're members of the European Union? Oh, God. It's all Theresa May's fault. She's too timorous. We should have sent in Donald Trump. And the minute those words came out of Boris Johnson's mouth, you just know that if he had a conscience, if he had a single iota of integrity, he'd have curdled
on that platform. He'd have visibly curdled. You can't say those words out loud if you care about honesty, truth, or even your own country. Sent Donald Trump in to do the negotiations. Absolutely absurd. But it works. And that last poor sod in the last hour, he proves that it works, because there are parallels between the two. Trump presiding over an absolute subversion of everything that America is supposed to stand for. Absolute subversion. One of his cheerleaders on Fox News yesterday was telling everybody who might get touched by the Mueller probe to destroy their phones, to smash them into tiny little bits, to bleach their SIM cards. And yet the entire Trump project was supposedly built upon the idea that Hillary Clinton was trying to avoid scrutiny. It's hypocrisy on an almost unbelievable scale, and it pains me to say it, that Johnson fits into that mindset, that purview, but he just does. There's no denying it. If you want to deny it, all you've got is the feels. All you've got is cards on the table. I feel that he's great. All right, give me some thinking, give me some evidence, give me some thought. I haven't got any. Sorry. Next caller. Richard's in Streatham. Richard, what would you like to say?
Well, hello there. Possibly looking at it a bit too deeply.
Not possible, Richard.
I'm a psychiatrist nurse, so I'm looking at it from almost from a subconscious perspective. Maybe there's a lot more people in this country who are like Boris Johnson and are drawn to Boris Johnson's behaviour and ideas than maybe the rest of us like to think. And that's where his support is generated. It's all about short-term gain, whatever that may be.
Like a sort of tabloid approach to politics. It doesn't matter what the facts are. What's the biggest emotional reaction I'm going to get in the immediate?
You might well have summed that up much more succinctly than I could.
Well, you inspired me.
It's that sort of psychology in operation. And also, I would like to say that the insult to Churchill, good grief, Churchill made mistakes. And one of the big mistakes he made, of course, was supporting the Gallipoli campaign. And
the stuff in the bar in South Africa as well. No. I mean,
and what did he do after Gallipoli? He volunteered as a private in the trenches. I can't imagine Boris doing something like that, can you?
No, I can't, actually. Not in a million years. I know it was a rhetorical question, but I shall grace it with an answer. The problem we have now, then, is the problem that everything seems to be distilling down to, is that you are now condescending to people who don't like thinking. And when they... I mean, you're not going to get turned over by the sun.
And even that, I'm not even sure if it's about not ability to think.
It's a reluctance. Everyone's got the ability to think. It's just that the more you think about things, the harder it is to have strong opinions, I find.
And the other concept I'd like to bring up, maybe I'm thinking it too deeply here, but I'm making the assumption here you've heard of true believer syndrome.
Yes, like religion.
That's right, yeah, or it's more better applied to people who claim that they're psychics. And even when the psychic says that they've been lying, people still believe it.
It's a need. It's a need to believe something, and it often boils down to, in the context of right-wing politics, it's a need to believe that the reason why things haven't gone well for you is because of foreigners, the European Union, Muslims, whatever it may be. Because
I'm all for that.
Yeah.
Yes. I think people vote. A lot of people voted out simply because there's a Polish shop selling nice cakes up the street.
Yeah. If you don't like Polish cake, don't eat it. It's complicated. And what's the shop going to be now? It's going to be empty. It's not going to be replaced by, I don't know, John Bull's delicatessen selling pork pies and gammon.
But I do think there's a lot of subconscious process going on, and I think the current sort of politics actually reinforces that, and how to turn out. I'm no Tory, I can assure you, but how can the Tory party regain some sense of you mentioned Thatcher earlier on. She had conviction, a sense of conviction.
She also invented the single market, of course, which her spiritual disciples are apparently determined to leave, which again is more evidence of the fact that they hate thinking.
Yes.
Well, I might need your professional services, Richard.
There's a lot of subconscious processes going on, and the media and the mail, etc., are reinforcing it. They should not be encouraging failure to think. They should be encouraging the ability to think.
Well, all change at the Mail. The new editor of the Daily Mail is a very intelligent, empathetic, charming, and profoundly pro-Remain individual. So it is going to be very, very interesting to see what transpires over there. Although, as I said yesterday, I don't derive much pleasure from it myself, although I will be watching that space very closely, because it's another one of my predictions that have come true. All of the key architects of this disaster are not going to be there when reality bites. They've run for the hills. Don's in Harrow. Don, I think last word to you, and then we'll crack on with something different. What's it going to be?
Yeah, hi. Actually, I'm in Burnham now. But,
sorry, Don.
Originally from Harrow.
I'm glad we've cleared that up.
No, I mean, Boris Johnson, if you were Boris Johnson and you lied to people, you know, in your first election to become mayor, you became mayor, you lied to people to be re-elected, it worked. Why would you tell the public the truth? They obviously...
But all politicians, no politician has ever been held to manifesto pledges. All politicians get elected on pledges that they don't deliver on. I'm not going to single him out for that. I'm pretty sure Sadiq Khan said stuff about Uber or Heathrow that he's changed his mind about or failed to deliver on as his successor as mayor. So it can't just be that, can it?
No, I'm saying if you were Boris Johnson has told biblical lies. They're not just untruths. These are things that I say this in the morning and that in the afternoon. You've got to look at it from Boris Johnson's point of view. He is basically saying the average person out there will not go against me. They will not say anything. They will accept what I'm saying. So I'll do it again. You can't expect Boris Johnson to all of a sudden grow a conscience and say, well, what has gotten me to the very edge of becoming Prime Minister, I should now stop doing. You can't expect that of Boris Johnson. And to say that somehow he should have a heart and he should have a conscience, this is not something that you expect from Boris Johnson. He's never said he is like that, or he would ever be like that.
No, well, I don't. I know that. You're preaching to the choir with me, but that because it is... That's why the catalogue, it's important to get it all out there. His career began with him being fired from the Times for making up a quote from his own godfather. It will end when some calumny or act of moral corruption is so epic, so biblical, to use your rather wonderful adjective, that even he can't crawl back from it. But at the moment, I don't know. I mean, you look at the White House, how vile do you have to be to lose the support of the gammon?
If you're rich, if you're posh, you can get away with anything. Rich and posh, you can literally do what you like.
I think you're right.
The country is based on class. It's based on people looking up to people who they shouldn't be and looking down on people they shouldn't be.
Doff cap, Tug Forlock, vote Rees-Mogg. Mate, I'm late for the break. Don, have a great day. Just look, final word, then we'll move on to drill music and the relationship between culture and criminality. But John Redwood, do you remember him? Last time he was in the news, he was telling investors to take their money out of Britain while telling voters that we should definitely continue on the path to leave the European Union. He just tweeted, someone just sent it to me. I'm just going to check what the front page actually says, because again, it's one of those moments where you just go, are we existing in parallel universes? So, Boris Johnson, as you know, has been taped and it's been released. It is currently on the front page of the paper of record in this country, The Times. The leak came from BuzzFeed, actually. I hope they're getting the credit they deserve. They're doing some stunning work over at BuzzFeed. Media model in this country is changing, but I'm too old to understand how and why. BuzzFeed is a very good example of it. So you've literally got the Foreign Secretary on front pages slagging off our negotiating position, our so-called negotiating position. Right? The Foreign Secretary, the holder of one of the four great offices of state, is on the front page of the Thunderer, the Times of London, slagging off our negotiating position. In Redwood Land, however, the problem is caused by Remain parts of the media who are damaging their own position and trying to undermine the UK's negotiating position. So journalists telling the truth, journalists explaining things, journalists describing stuff are It's just unbelievable. Rehashing old Project Fear myths or parodying themselves by inventing a new one. I don't quite understand what that means. In doing so, they damage their own position, bore much of the nation rigid, and try to undermine the UK's negotiating position. How completely skewed would your intellect have to be on a day that the Foreign Secretary is specifically slagging off the country's negotiating position on the front pages of national newspapers? How utterly at odds with reality would you have to be to sit there in John Redwood land and think, I'm going to send a tweet about how it's all the fault of those awful Remainers? He's the flipping Foreign Secretary. He's on the front pages. He's slagging off our negotiating position. But it's Remainer journalists who are undermining it. Again, just be quiet. Hear the pennies drop. How utterly absurd. I don't even know what the word is anymore to describe that level of daftness. The Foreign Secretary and arch-Brexiter Boris Johnson is on the front page of most national newspapers slagging off his government's, our government's, the British government's negotiating position. But the pro-Brexit disease is now so advanced that for somebody like John Redwood, the big story is actually journalists reporting facts. Because that's what's undermining our negotiating position. Not the Foreign Secretary publicly undermining our negotiating position. That's not undermining our negotiating position. Boris Johnson undermining our negotiating position in front of a crowd of Conservative donors does not undermine our negotiating position at all, even when it gets leaked to BuzzFeed and printed on the front page of every national newspaper in the land. That's not undermining our negotiating position at all. What is undermining our negotiating position is people pointing out that our negotiating position is a bit rubbish. Because we haven't got one. Because we're still pretending that you can have regulatory alignment between two separate customs unions. Just amongst other things.